My name is Ethan, and I've been a truck driver for over 15 years. I've seen it all on the road. Animals crossing in the middle of the night, horrible accidents, and even people trying to hitchhike in the most unlikely places. I never paid much attention to the stories other drivers told at stops, ghosts, cursed roads, and other nonsense. But one night, driving along a deserted stretch of Route 66, something happened that changed my life forever. I was in the middle of a long haul, hauling a load of appliances to a warehouse in Arizona. It was late at night, and the only things lighting the road were the headlights of my truck and the occasional glow of the full moon. The radio was playing a soft classic rock station, and the silence of the desert was almost comforting. That's when I saw her. She was standing on the side of the road next to a small rusty pole with a barely readable license plate. She was wearing a white dress that looked like it was from another time, something you'd expect to see in an old movie. Her dark hair fell in messy cascades over her shoulders, and she slowly raised her arm, signaling for me to stop. For a moment I considered driving on. It wasn't uncommon to see strangers trying to hitchhike, and most of the time, it was safer not to get involved. But something about the way she stood, almost motionless, made me uncomfortable. I slowed down and parked the truck a few feet away from her. "Do you need help?" I asked, rolling down the window. She didn't answer right away. She just walked up to the passenger side, her steps slow and silent. When she got close enough, I noticed that her eyes were large and dark, almost without reflection. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice soft, almost melodious. I hesitated for a moment, but then I unlocked the door. She climbed into the truck with precise movements, sitting in the passenger seat. Her dress was slightly dirty, as if she had been walking for a long time. "Where are you going?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Straight ahead," she replied without looking at me. Starting the engine again, I started driving. The silence inside the cabin was oppressive, interrupted only by the sound of tires on the road. "What were you doing out here alone in the middle of nowhere?" I ventured, trying to break the awkward atmosphere. "Just looking for a way," she said, without going into details. As we drove on, I realized something was wrong. The radio started emitting static and the GPS went dark as if it had lost signal. "Damn GPS," I muttered, tapping the device. The woman didn't seem to notice any of this. She just stared straight ahead as if she knew exactly where we were going. "Do you believe in destiny?" she asked suddenly, taking me by surprise. "I guess so. I mean, everything happens for a reason, doesn't it?" She smiled slightly but didn't answer. Her smile gave me chills. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I realized something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't there. I could clearly see the empty bench where she should have been sitting, but nothing else. I swallowed hard, trying not to lose control. "So, where do you want to get off?" I asked, my voice shaking a little. She pointed vaguely ahead to a dark, deserted area where the road seemed to disappear into the horizon. "Right there," she said. My breathing was heavy, and the discomfort was almost unbearable. Something inside me screamed to stop the truck and send her away. But before I could decide what to do, I realized that the landscape around us didn't change. It was as if we were stuck on the same stretch of road, with the same rocks, the same dry bushes passing by over and over again. When I looked at the dashboard, the digital clock was frozen. "This isn't right," I muttered, feeling a chill run up my spine. The woman finally turned to me. Her eyes now seemed deeper, like two pools of darkness. "There's no turning back on every road, Ethan." I froze. How did she know my name? Before I could say anything, the headlights went out for a moment, and when they came back on, the woman was gone. The truck's cabin was empty, but the smell of wilted flowers lingered in the air. The woman had disappeared, but the discomfort she had brought had not. The truck's cabin was cold. The smell of wilted flowers lingered, and the silence around me was absolute. I glanced again in the rearview mirror, hoping to see something, anything, that would explain what had just happened. But there was nothing. Just the emptiness of the road behind me. I took a deep breath and kept driving. Part of me wanted to believe that it was all due to fatigue, a trick of my mind after so many hours behind the wheel. But as I drove down the road, I realized that something was terribly wrong. The GPS remained off, and the radio emitted a low static. Even more worrying, the landscape around me seemed stuck in time. The same rocks, the same bushes, the same shadows. It was like driving on an endless loop. That's when I saw her again. She was in the middle of the road, a few meters away, standing still as if she had never left. Her hair swayed slightly in the wind, but the rest of her body was still. "It can't be," I whispered, gripping the steering wheel. This time I didn't stop. I accelerated, determined to get through that vision. But when the headlights reached her, the light seemed to pass through her as if it were made of smoke. My heart raced, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, there she was again, stopped in the middle of the road, closer than before. I stopped the truck abruptly, the engine roaring before going silent. I needed to understand what was happening. I grabbed my flashlight and got out of the vehicle, the cold night air cutting into my skin. When I turned back to the road, she was no longer there. I took a few steps forward, shining the flashlight into nothingness. That's when I noticed something on the side of the road. An old, rusty car with broken windows and a dented roof. It looked like it had been there for decades, but the tire tracks around it were fresh. I approached the car cautiously. Inside, I saw a picture frame lying face down on the driver's seat. I picked it up and wiped the dirty glass with my hands. My blood ran cold when I saw the photo. It was the woman who had gotten into my truck. All around the car were belongings scattered about: clothes, shoes, purses. It was as if someone had emptied a trunk in a hurry. Among the objects, I found several identity cards. I flipped through them, and each one belonged to a missing person, all dated within the last 20 years. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, shining my flashlight, but I saw nothing, just the empty road. "You're staying here too." Her voice came soft, almost like a whisper in the wind. The flashlight flickered and went out. The air around me grew heavy, and a low sound began to grow. Footsteps, voices, something scraping against the asphalt. Then I realized I was no longer alone. Figures began to emerge from the darkness, men and women in torn clothing, their faces pale and empty. They moved slowly toward me, forming a circle. "Fate chooses who stays," the woman's voice said again. There she was, standing in the middle of the circle, her face now distorted into something that was not human. Her eyes, once dark, glowed with an intense, almost hypnotic light. I tried to run, but the figures blocked my path. I felt cold hands grip my arms and legs, pulling me to the ground. My screams echoed through the night, but were soon drowned out by the sound of static, the same sound that had come from the truck's radio. The last thing I saw was the woman's face leaning over me, her expression now a mix of sadness and pleasure. "Welcome to the road, Ethan." Days later, my truck was found parked on the same stretch of Route 66, with the engine still running and the doors locked. On the passenger seat was a dried rose and a handwritten note: "No one escapes the road." The documents found at the scene added to the already long history of unexplained disappearances on that part of the highway. No one could explain what happened to me, but other drivers reported seeing a female figure on the following nights, always waving to passers-by. And so, the road continues to take its toll. My name is Clara, and since I was little, I have always been fascinated by mystery. Maybe it was the effect of the fantasy and suspense books I devoured, or maybe it was something deeper, a curiosity that never seemed satisfied. It was this curiosity that took me to New Orleans, a city full of stories, legends, and places that seemed to come from another world. I was looking for inspiration for a photography exhibition about historical places. The theme of the exhibition was Silences of the Past, and New Orleans seemed perfect. Between the narrow streets, the old mansions, and the echoes of voodoo culture, something about that city attracted me like a magnet. It was one sunny afternoon while talking to a tour guide that I heard about the Cemetery of Eternal Night. According to him, it was a place avoided even by the bravest residents. "They say it was built on cursed ground," explained the guide with a somber expression. "Black magic practices, sacrifices, things that no one likes to talk about." That only piqued my curiosity. a place full of history and atmosphere, perfect for my photos. I ignored the warnings and decided to visit it before sunset. The cemetery was located far from the city center, surrounded by tall trees and worn stone walls. The entrance was marked by a rusty iron gate, with the name engraved in barely legible letters. As soon as I passed through the gate, I felt a chill, despite the heat of the day. The place was unlike anything I had ever seen. Ornate tombs, crypts that looked like small houses, and statues that seemed to watch whoever passed by. The silence was profound, interrupted only by the occasional sound of the wind blowing through the trees. I began taking photos, fascinated by the details of the tombstones and the Latin inscriptions. Many of them were covered in moss, but some had strange symbols that I could not identify. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, the cemetery seemed to change. The shadows lengthened, and the golden light made the environment even more surreal. It was then that I noticed something strange. As I adjusted the focus of the camera, I saw a figure in the background, between two crypts. It was a tall figure, dressed in black, motionless as a statue. "Hello?" I called, but received no response. When I lowered the camera, the figure had disappeared. I felt a shiver, but I kept taking pictures. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps a visitor. But the uneasiness grew with each passing minute. A little later, I heard a sound. It was low, almost imperceptible, like a child's laughter, coming from somewhere to my left. I turned my head quickly, but saw no one. I kept walking, faster now, trying to find the exit. When I reached the main gate, my heart stopped. It was locked. I was sure I had left it open. I pulled hard on the rusty iron, but it didn't budge. "It can't be," I muttered, feeling the panic growing. I looked around, searching for another exit, but the cemetery seemed denser, as if the space had been compressed. The trees, once distant, now seemed closer, their shadows forming intricate patterns on the ground. It was then that I saw him again. The figure in black was standing a few feet away from me, between two tall tombstones. This time he moved, slowly, as if floating, disappearing behind a crypt. "Hey!" I shouted, more to dispel my fear than to get an answer. I ran toward him, but when I turned the corner of the crypt, there was no one, just absolute silence. When I looked back, I saw something that made me freeze. The tombstones around me were different. The names engraved on them were no longer unfamiliar. Instead, they were filled with familiar dates, birth and death dates that corresponded to people in my family. And in the center of it all, a tombstone with my name engraved on it. The sound of laughter echoed again, but this time it seemed to come from all sides. My breath caught in my chest as I stared at the headstone with my name engraved on it. The date of death was marked as today. I blinked, hoping it was some kind of mistake or illusion. But when I touched the cold surface of the stone, I felt the clear indentation of the letters. The laughter returned, louder this time, echoing throughout the cemetery. It was a macabre sound, one that didn't seem human. The shadows around me began to move. Trees that had previously seemed motionless now swayed, as if invisible winds were blowing through them. Suddenly I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly and saw him, the figure in black. He was closer now, and I could make out details that had previously been invisible. His face was cadaverous, with sunken eyes that glowed red. He wasn't walking. He glided along the ground as if unbound by the laws of this world. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised a long, bony hand, pointing to something behind me. When I turned, I saw one of the crypts open by itself, with a loud scraping sound of stone against stone. Inside the dark interior, something glowed faintly, as if calling to me. "No," I mumbled, stepping back. But it was too late. My legs began to move on their own, carrying me toward the open crypt. No matter how hard I struggled, it was as if an invisible force was pushing me forward. The interior of the crypt was cold and damp, and the smell of earth and decay was unbearable. In the center was a stone pedestal, upon which rested an ancient book. Its pages were open, and strange symbols were engraved on them, pulsing in a blood-red hue. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. The words made no sense, but there was something about them that felt familiar, as if they were being written as I read them. One sentence in particular made me freeze. The sacrifice must be complete for the gate to remain closed. Before I could process what it meant, I felt the ground shake. I looked back and saw that the figure had entered the crypt. He was closer now, his eyes glowing brightly. "You have opened the way, Clara," he said, his voice like muffled thunder. I tried to run, but I stumbled and fell to the ground. He approached slowly, and the shadows around him seemed to melt into him, making him even more imposing. "What do you want from me?" I asked, tears streaming down my face. "It's not what I want. It's what they want." He pointed to the entrance of the crypt, where other figures began to emerge. There were many of them. Men, women, and children, all pale and haggard with empty eyes and crooked smiles. They whispered my name over and over like a chant. "You are the sacrifice, Clara, the price to keep the veil between the worlds." I tried to scream, but my voice was drowned out by a sudden wind that filled the crypt. The figure raised its hands and an invisible force lifted me off the ground, holding me in the air. I felt something cold and sharp press against my chest, and a sharp pain shot through my body. My vision began to darken, but before it was over, I saw the figure leaning toward me, its eyes burning with a triumphant glow. Welcome to the eternal night. The next morning, New Orleans residents reported hearing screams and laughter coming from the cemetery throughout the night. When authorities went to investigate, they found the gate open and scratch marks on the headstones as if something had gotten out. Clara's camera was found in one of the crypts. Her last photos showed humanoid shadows and the figure in black staring directly into the lens with a cadaverous smile. She was never seen again. But ever since that night, it is said that laughter and whispers can be heard in the cemetery, especially at sunset. And for the bravest who enter, there is always a new tombstone with a name engraved on it that no one recognizes. I've always been fascinated by forgotten places. There's something inexplicable about exploring ruins, hearing the stories that the weathered walls whisper. My name is Jake, and together with my girlfriend Emma, I dedicate my weekends to exploring abandoned places and documenting them in photos and videos. Our latest discovery took us to Florida, to the most eerie place we've ever encountered, Encanto Park. The park opened in the 1970s and was a popular destination for families, but a devastating fire closed it just a few years later. Many say the flames consumed more than just wood and plastic. They took souls, leaving something dark behind. We arrived at the park at dusk. The sun was still casting golden rays, but the shadows of the tall trees around it made the place seem plunged into darkness. The main gate was fallen down, overgrown with weeds, and the rusty sign barely made the words Encanto Park legible. "Sounds perfect for an epic video," Emma said, adjusting her camera. I nodded, but there was something in the air. A faintly sweet smell mixed with the metallic odor of rust that made me uneasy. We walked in. The first thing we saw was the Ferris wheel. It was tilted, its cabins dangling from broken chains, as if a strong wind might topple it at any moment. Beside it, overgrown carousels seemed buried in time, and roller coaster tracks poked out of the undergrowth. "Look at that!" Emma exclaimed, pointing to a cotton candy stand. Inside was a machine that looked like it had been used yesterday, with dried bits of cotton candy still stuck to the sides. "Strange," I muttered, running my hand over the machine. It was too clean for something that should have been abandoned for decades. As we walked deeper into the park, the atmosphere seemed to change. The air grew heavier, and the silence was broken by a faint but recognizable sound, the melody of a carousel. "Jake, are you hearing that?" Emma asked, looking around. I was. The sound was coming from far away, but it shouldn't have. There was no electricity in the park, and besides, the carousel we'd seen was completely destroyed. We followed the melody, our flashlights illuminating the way. We reached the center of the park, where a rusty control booth was partially hidden under a fallen tree. Inside, we found papers, tools, and a diary. The pages were yellowed but legible. The first few pages told of the park's construction and its early years of success. But as we progressed, the tone changed. One entry caught my eye. The shadows appear after sunset. They don't speak, but I hear them. Something is wrong here, but no one believes me. I kept reading. The last few pages described rides running on their own, children's voices where there were no others, and shadowy figures wandering between attractions. The author wrote shortly before the fire, "The park never wanted to let anyone go. The souls that enter here are his." Emma read over my shoulder, and her expression changed from curiosity to fear. "I think we should go, Jake," she said, her voice low. I nodded, but as we stepped out of the booth, I realized something was wrong. The sound of the carousel was louder now, and dim lights were flickering in the distance, illuminating the Ferris wheel. "That's not possible," I murmured, pulling Emma closer. She pointed toward the entrance to the park. The gates, which had been down when we arrived, were now upright and locked with chains. The park seemed to be waking up. The Ferris wheel spun slowly, emitting a high-pitched metallic sound that tore through the silence. The lights that flashed in faded colors made no sense. There was no electricity in the park. Emma grabbed my arm, her pale face reflecting the fear I felt. "Jake, we need to get out of here," she said, her voice barely audible over the booming music of the carousel. We made it to the gates, but they were locked with thick chains that hadn't been there when we arrived. I tried to force them, but it was useless. I looked around looking for another way out, but the park seemed to have changed. The paths we had taken were different, as if the rides had moved. Suddenly, the sound of the carousel stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, looking back. Before I could answer, footsteps echoed in the distance, as if someone was running between the rides. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the sound, but all I saw were shadows moving too fast to be human. "Jake," Emma began, but her voice trailed off. I followed her gaze and saw something that chilled me to the bone. Near the Ferris wheel, a figure stood. He was dressed like a clown, but the costume was dirty and torn. His face, partially covered by a faded mask, seemed twisted into a grotesque smile. He didn't move, but I knew he was watching us. "Come on, now!" I pulled Emma by the hand, trying to get us away from there. We ran aimlessly, passing stalls and rides, but the park seemed endless. Every corner took us back to places we had already been, as if we were trapped in a maze. The music came back, but this time it came from all sides, as if the entire park was alive. A mechanical sound mixed with the melody, and I realized that the roller coaster was working. Their rusty cars moved along the tracks by themselves, and children's voices echoed, laughing and shouting, but there was no one there. Emma stumbled and fell beside me. As I helped her up, I noticed something in her hand. She had found a piece of paper on the floor, crumpled and dirty. I unfolded it and saw a list of names written in shaky handwriting. At the bottom, the last two names were ours, Jake Mitchell and Emma Carter. "This can't be," I whispered, feeling panic overcome me. Emma began to cry. "Jake, they knew we would be here." Before we could think of another way out, the sound of footsteps came again, closer this time. Shadows began to form around us, and indistinct figures emerged from the rides. They were children, or what was left of them. Their faces were distorted, and their eyes glowed with a dull hue. They began to walk toward us slowly, as if they were surrounding us. The clown appeared again, this time closer. His grotesque grin widened, and he pointed toward the Ferris wheel, now spinning faster. "This way!" I yelled, pulling Emma toward a game booth. We hid behind the counter, trying to control our breathing. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that looked like a key hanging from a nail. I grabbed it, hoping it was the key to the gates. "We need to get back to the entrance," I whispered. Emma nodded, and we ran as fast as we could. The figures began to move faster, their screams and laughter filling the air. We reached the gates, and I tried to fit the key into the lock. My heart was beating so fast I could barely breathe. The key turned. The chains fell with a crash, and the gates began to open. But before we could get out, Emma screamed. I looked back and saw that she was being pulled. One of the childlike figures had grabbed her leg, and the others were closing in, dragging her back. "No!" I ran to her, trying to free her, but the shadows were too strong. Emma looked at me, tears streaming down her face. "Go, Jake, get out of here." "I won't leave you," I screamed, but the shadows swallowed her completely. I stood still for a moment, unable to process what had happened. Then, I felt something touch my shoulder. I turned and saw the clown, his eyes now glowing brightly. I ran. I ran as fast as I could through the gates and throwing myself onto the deserted road. Days later, I found the strength to go back with the police, but the park was no longer there. The place was empty, covered in trees and vegetation, as if the park had never existed. The only thing left was the diary we found, now with 2 more names added to the list: Jake Mitchell and Emma Carter. And every time I close my eyes, I can still hear the carousel music. My name is David Walker. I'm 34 years old and an investigative journalist. I have explored many abandoned places, unraveling urban legends and debunking stories that seem supernatural. I've never been the type to believe in ghosts or curses, at least not until that night at the Pension Lorraine. New Orleans is a city where the past never dies. The French Quarter is a tapestry of history and mystery. Every corner, every old building seems to hold secrets in its shadows. And among them, Pension Lorraine stood out. Abandoned since the 19th century, it is said to still be inhabited by the echoes of its former owner and the guests who never left. I parked the car on a quiet, narrow street. The air was heavy, filled with the smell of damp earth and a little too sweet for comfort. The full moon was hidden by dense clouds, casting an oppressive darkness over the 2-story building in front of me. The facade of the guest house was deteriorated with broken windows and rotting wood. The flashlight light trembled in my hand as I approached the double wooden doors. Engraved on the sign above in worn letters, it read, Pension Lorraine. "Come on, David. It's just another old building," I muttered to myself, trying to dispel the shiver running up my spine. I pushed the door open and it opened with a prolonged creak, as if signaling that I was not welcome. The lobby was a vision frozen in time. Dusty armchairs were arranged around a tea table, with cracked glasses still in their places. A winding staircase led to the second floor, its boards creaking under the weight of the past. I took a few steps inside, and the door closed behind me with a loud bang. My heart raced, but I tried to stay calm. I took a deep breath and focused on the mission, finding something concrete for the article. Some logical explanation for the reports of whispers and the rope marks on visitors' wrists. The flashlight illuminated the environment in unstable beams. The shadows seemed to dance around me, forming crooked figures that disappeared when I turned. A marble sculpture in the corner of the lobby, a blindfolded female figure, seemed to be watching me. I climbed the first steps of the stairs. Each step was accompanied by a groan of ancient wood. The silence was alive, pulsing around me. When I reached the top, a soft whisper broke the silence. "You shouldn't be here." My muscles contracted. The flashlight shook in my hand. I turned in every direction, but the hallway was empty. Just closed doors and peeling wallpaper. "Focus, David," I murmured. I chose the nearest door and pushed it open. It was a guest room, frozen in time. A bed with yellowed sheets, a dresser covered in dust, and a cracked mirror. I approached the mirror, observing my distorted reflection. For a moment I thought I saw another figure beside me, a woman with a pale face and empty eyes. I blinked, and she disappeared. A cold draft blew through the room, and the mirror made a sharp crack. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. A scratching sound began to echo from the wall behind the bed. Approaching cautiously, I pulled away the peeling wallpaper. Below, words were scratched into the wood as if someone had used fingernails or a knife. "She's still here." My throat dried up. A chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, I felt pressure on my wrists as if invisible hands were holding them tightly. I looked down and saw red marks appearing on my skin. I pulled my arms back, fighting something I couldn't see. "Let go of me," I shouted. The pressure disappeared. I breathed heavily, fear taking over me. I turned to run, but the bedroom door closed on its own with a bang. The whisper came again, closer this time, hissing in my ear. "You are the next guest." The flashlight light went out. Panic gripped me. My fingers shook as I tried to turn the flashlight back on. When the light came back on, I saw for a split second the reflection of a woman in a dark dress, smiling with chapped lips and empty eyes. The flashlight fell out of my hand. With a desperate effort, I ran towards the door and threw it open. The hallway seemed darker than before. I stumbled down the stairs, feeling the weight of invisible eyes on me. When I finally reached the exit door, I pushed it open and ran out into the street. The cold night air enveloped me like a hug of relief. I looked back. The windows of the boarding house were dark, but I could have sworn a silhouette was standing on the second floor watching. I knew it wasn't over. Lorraine Pension still had guests, and maybe soon I would be one of them. The cold of the street enveloped me, but it wasn't enough to calm my racing heart. The dark windows of the Lorraine Pension watched me. I should leave, but something was holding me back. An invisible force, an unanswered question. My mind screamed to run, but my legs had other plans. I swallowed hard, took a deep breath, and went back inside. The door creaked shut behind me with a dry snap. The air was heavier. Each step on the floor creaked, as if the building were alive and aware of my presence. The flashlight trembled in my hand, casting shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. I climbed the stairs. At the top, the hallway was darker and longer. A door at the end was ajar, a faint light leaking through it. I took a deep breath and approached it. I pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. It was a different room. The four-poster bed was intact, the sheets crisp and white. An antique dressing table glowed in the light of a nearly extinguished candle. In the mirror, I saw my reflection, but I was not alone. Madame Lorraine stood behind me. I turned abruptly. She stood there, dressed in black, her face pale, her eyes empty as bottomless wells. A cold smile curved her cracked lips. "You're back to stay," she whispered. My legs were trapped. I tried to run, but an invisible pressure held my ankles. My wrists burned as if invisible ropes were squeezing them. "Why?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "My guests never leave," she replied, her voice sweet and rotten. The candle went out. The room plunged into darkness. A buzzing sound filled my ears, followed by whispers and several voices, all pleading for help. The pressure increased in my wrists. The bed seemed to beckon to me like an open grave waiting to be filled. With all my strength, I pulled my legs up. The invisible bonds gave way. I ran for the door, stumbling over furniture. Madame Lorraine slid across the floor behind me, her face contorted in rage. "You can't escape," she screamed. I ran down the stairs, the steps creaking like bones breaking. The walls seemed to close in, doors slamming shut around me. I reached the entrance and slammed my shoulder into the door. It didn't budge. Madame Lorraine was close. The air turned frigid, the smell of decay filling my nostrils. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and knocked on the door again. It swung open. I fell to the cold sidewalk. The sound of the door closing echoed like thunder. Gasping, I looked back. The windows were dark, but on the second floor, a silhouette watched me. Madame Lorraine's smile visible even in the shadows. I stood up shakily. My hands still had red marks on my wrists. She had almost trapped me. I walked away, each step heavier. The boarding house seemed to be watching me until I turned the corner. I knew it wasn't over. The Lorraine boarding house was still waiting for new guests, and I had barely escaped. My name is Rachel Green. I'm 32 years old and have been a private researcher for almost a decade. I've worked on cases of disappearances, fraud, and urban mysteries. I've always been skeptical. I have always believed that behind any bizarre event there is a logical explanation. Or at least he believed so until he set foot on that farm in the middle of nowhere in rural Kansas. The McAllister family disappeared 2 weeks ago. John and Margaret McAllister, along with their 2 children, simply evaporated. When the local sheriff called me to investigate, he just said, "There's something strange there, Rachel, something we don't understand." Now I was there in front of the old farm. The sunset light tinted everything in shades of red and gold, casting long, distorted shadows. The wind blew through the cornfields, making the leaves rustle like ancient voices. The main house was in front of me, 2 stories of worn wood and broken windows. But what really caught my attention were the scarecrows scattered across the fields. There were at least a dozen of them, positioned irregularly. They seemed to be looking at the house. Something about those scarecrows made me shudder. I stopped in front of the porch, the rotten wood creaking beneath my feet. I pushed the door, which slowly opened with a prolonged groan. The interior was frozen in time. Plates of food were still on the kitchen table, covered in mold. The chairs were turned over, as if the family had left in a hurry. "McAllister's?" I called, knowing there would be no answer. The only response was heavy, oppressive silence. I climbed the stairs, the steps creaking in protest. In the master bedroom, I found a messy bed and a journal on the nightstand. The cover was worn and the pages were yellowed. I sat on the edge of the bed and started leafing through. The first pages were normal, records of the farm's daily life. But as I progressed, the writing became more frantic. John McAllister was talking about an ancient covenant, a tradition to ensure good harvests. He mentioned something about scarecrows that needed to be respected. The last pages were torn out. A shiver ran down my spine. I closed the diary and left the room. As I passed through the hallway, I saw something through the window that made me stop. One of the scarecrows had changed position. Before, he was in the middle of the field. Now I was at the edge of the cornfield, facing the house. His cloth face, sewn with black threads, seemed to stare at me. "It must be the wind," I muttered, trying to ignore the fear rising in my chest. I went downstairs and out into the backyard. The sun was almost disappearing over the horizon, casting a gloom over the farm. I walked to the edge of the cornfield. The scarecrow was just a few meters away from me. His clothes were old and tattered, but there was something about his straw arms, something almost human. I approached slowly. A draft of cold air swept past me and the smell of damp earth intensified. I reached out to touch the scarecrow, but something stopped me. The surrounding shadows seemed thicker, as if the field itself was holding its breath. A whisper came from the cornfield. "You shouldn't be here." My heart raced. I turned the flashlight onto the field, but there was no one there. Just rows and rows of corn, swaying gently in the wind. I tried to laugh at my own fear, but the sound came out weak. "Okay, Rachel, breathe. That's just your imagination." When I turned to go back to the house, I froze. The scarecrow was now closer. There was no explanation for that. Its button eyes reflected the flashlight light in a sickly way. Its straw arms were outstretched as if it wanted to grab me. I backed away, my entire body screaming to run. But before I could move, I heard another whisper, louder this time. "The harvest needs to be paid for." A sharp crack came from behind me. I turned and saw another scarecrow, slowly climbing out of the cornfield, its wooden feet scraping the ground. More scarecrows began to appear, emerging from the shadows, forming a circle around me. Panic gripped me. I ran toward the house, my feet stumbling in the loose dirt. I didn't look back. I could only hear the whispers and the sound of the scarecrows moving. When I reached the porch, I threw myself inside and slammed the door. My breathing was out of control. Silence returned, but I knew I wasn't safe. I looked out the window. The scarecrows were standing in the yard, motionless again. But now they were all facing the house. They were waiting. And I knew the night was just beginning. The silence inside the house was thick, broken only by the sound of my rapid breathing. Outside, the scarecrows remained still, their silhouettes distorted by the shadows of the night. I knew I couldn't stay there for long. They were waiting, and I had no idea what would happen when they decided to move again. My eyes were fixed on the window, watching each straw figure. Their button eyes shone in the moonlight, reflecting a cold, cruel emptiness. My entire body screamed to get out of there, but where to? The cornfield was a dark maze full of ancient secrets. Staying or running seemed like two sides of the same cursed coin. A dry noise came from the back of the house, a slow, rhythmic scratching like nails scraping against wood. My heart raced. I gripped the flashlight tightly and moved toward the sound. Each step was an effort to control the fear that consumed me. I reached the kitchen. The back door was ajar, and a cold wind blew in, bringing with it the smell of damp earth and rot. The light from my flashlight flickered as I shone it into the doorway. There were dirt footprints on the ground. Not human, but not straw either. I swallowed hard and took a step back. The harvest must be paid for. A drawling voice whispered from every direction. The door swung open with a sharp thud, and something crawled into the house. It was one of the scarecrows. Its straw arms moved with grotesque stiffness, and its stitched head was tilted at an unnatural angle. The ropes that bound it seemed to pulse, as if they were alive. This one was different from the others. It was larger, and its button eyes seemed to burn with an inner light. Every movement it made felt forced, as if it were being controlled by something invisible. I had to get out of here. I ran into the main room, but the scarecrows were already moving, blocking every exit. They were closer now, their shadows lengthening and blending into the darkness of the house. Each step was accompanied by the sound of rustling straw and splintering wood under their impossible weight. A cold panic gripped me. Then I remembered John McAllister's journal. It spoke of a pact and an offering clearing. Perhaps there was a way to break the cycle. I took a deep breath and ran to the front door, dodging the slowly approaching figures. I yanked the door open and ran into the cornfield, the darkness closing in around me. The cornstalks brushed my face, whispering like mocking voices. The scarecrows were behind me, the sound of rustling straw growing louder. My legs ached, but I couldn't stop. Finally, I reached the clearing. It was exactly as described in the journal. A circle of packed earth lit by the full moon. In the center, a rotting wooden altar with symbols scratched into it. On top of the altar, the remains of burned ropes and bones too small to be animals. This was where the sacrifices were made. The scarecrows appeared at the edge of the clearing, forming a circle around me. Their empty eyes glowed with a cold, unforgiving light. "The harvest must be paid," they said in unison, their voices coming from mouths sewn shut. My eyes fixed on the altar. I grabbed the lantern and threw it at the dry wood. The flames flared quickly, licking at the ancient symbols. A scream echoed through the night, not from the scarecrows, but from something deeper, something trapped in this earth for too long. The scarecrows stopped. Their forms trembled and began to crumble, the straw breaking free and burning in the light of the flames. One by one they fell, reduced to ash as the fire consumed the altar. Silence returned, but it was different now. The evil presence had disappeared. The oppressive weight that had suffocated the air had lifted. Panting, I fell to my knees. The clearing was full of ash and a burning smell. I had broken the pact. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. I got up and walked back to the house. Everything was quiet. The shadows seemed less threatening. When I reached the car, I took one last look at the farm. The fields were empty, the scarecrows gone. But I knew that the earth never forgets. Those crops had been paid for in blood for decades. And even though the scarecrows were gone, something told me that the soil was still hungry. My name is Tom Harris. I'm 42 years old, and I've been a truck driver for almost 2 decades. I've driven from one end of the country to the other, through deserted highways and ghost towns. I've seen sandstorms, blizzards, and accidents I'd rather forget. But I've never encountered anything that really scared me. Roads are just that, pieces of asphalt that take you from one point to another. Until now. When I accepted my overnight delivery on Route 666, I didn't pay much attention to the warnings from the locals. They talked about the road as if it were alive, as if it could swallow the unwary. I laughed, thanked them for the tips, and continued on my way. It was midnight when my tires touched the cracked asphalt of Route 666. The sky was covered in heavy clouds and there was no moon, just darkness, and my headlights illuminated the road for a few feet ahead. I turned on the radio to chase away the silence, but all I could hear was low, irritating static. I tried to change the station, but the hissing continued. I huffed and turned off the radio. That was better. I needed to concentrate. The road seemed endless. Miles and miles of empty asphalt, flanked by flat deserts and dry bushes that disappeared into the darkness. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. 0045. The GPS was on, but it didn't seem to help much. The route wasn't updating. The arrow stayed in the same place, as if I wasn't moving. "Damn," I muttered, giving the GPS a light tap. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Nothing but darkness. But for a second, a brief second, I thought I saw something move behind the truck. A tall, dark figure on the side of the road. I blinked and looked again. Nothing. "You're just tired, Tom, that's all." I accelerated a little more. The engine roared. The truck moved forward. The warm wind blew against the cabin, making a low, continuous sound, almost like a whisper. My eyes were heavy, but there was no place to stop. There was nothing on this road but more road. Suddenly, something caught my eye to the right. A small gas station appeared on the horizon. Dim lights illuminated the gas pumps and a convenience store. It was a relief to see something other than the endless desert. I pulled over and got out. The silence was almost palpable. No sound of insects, no wind, just the creak of my footsteps on the asphalt. The store doors were open, but the place looked abandoned. The sign flickered intermittently, a light bulb struggling to stay on. "Is anyone here?" I called, my voice echoing. No answer. I walked into the store. Empty shelves, packages of expired snacks, a thin layer of dust covering everything. I walked up to the counter. An old cash register was open, but no money. Just as I was about to leave, the phone on the counter rang. The sound was like an electric shock going through my body. A phone ringing in a place like this? I swallowed hard and answered. "Hello?" My voice was hoarse. A whispered voice on the other end answered, "Why are you still on the road, Tom?" My heart stopped for a second. Before I could answer, the line went dead. I put the phone back in its cradle and backed away slowly. My hands were sweaty. I looked out of the store. The truck was there, but something seemed wrong. The gas station lights began to flicker and go out. Darkness took over everything. I ran to the truck, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. The headlights came on, illuminating the road. I sighed, trying to calm my heartbeat. I put the truck in drive and drove on. The gas station disappeared in the rearview mirror, swallowed by darkness. But something wasn't right. I drove for another 20 minutes, and to my astonishment, the same gas station appeared again on the right. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel. It couldn't be. I had been driving straight ahead. There was no way I could have come back to the same place. No, I muttered. I drove straight past the gas station, fear rising like bile in my throat. I kept driving, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The silence inside the cabin seemed to scream. The GPS was still frozen. The clock on the dashboard read 00:45. It hadn't moved a minute. And then I saw it. In the rearview mirror, a shadowy figure was standing in the middle of the road, motionless, its long arms hanging at its sides. When I looked again, there was nothing. But I knew it was there, and the road ahead seemed to stretch on forever. My eyes burned as I gripped the steering wheel. The clock on the dashboard still read 00:45, and Route 666 stretched like an endless snake in the darkness. My chest felt heavy with a mixture of fear and frustration. This road felt like an endless nightmare. I took a deep breath, trying to clear my head. This was not the time to panic. I needed to focus. Something wasn't right, but there had to be a logical explanation for all of this. The fatigue. This had to be delirium caused by exhaustion. I had been driving for hours without rest. The human mind is treacherous when deprived of sleep. I had heard stories of truck drivers who had seen impossible things after long journeys. The radio crackled again. The same distorted voice emerged from the static. "You shouldn't be here." I shivered, but this time I took a deep breath and forced a bitter smile. "It's just static," I muttered. "Just static and a tired brain." Suddenly, an idea hit me like a punch. I grabbed my phone and opened the backup GPS I used on complicated trips. The signal was weak, but the route began to load. Instead of showing the same frozen position, the new route indicated something different, a detour a few miles ahead. I stepped on the gas. This might be my only chance to get off this damn road. The headlights illuminated the road. and the cracked asphalt sped past under my wheels. The shadows on the sides of the road still seemed to move, but I ignored them. Whether they were illusions or something else, I couldn't afford to think about it now. Finally, I saw the sign for a detour to the right. It was barely visible, covered in dust and partially fallen, but it was there. Detour 34, alternate route. I turned the wheel firmly and turned onto the new road. The asphalt gave way to a rough gravel track, but a sense of relief began to grow in my chest. The GPS indicated that I was off Route 666. I kept driving. The sky slowly began to lighten. A soft shade of blue appeared on the horizon. The clock on the dashboard finally ticked to 5:30. Time was ticking again. I let out a nervous laugh. It was like a giant weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Route 666 was no longer visible, just a dirt road disappearing into the desert landscape. After another hour of driving, I arrived in a small town. I pulled over at a gas station, got out, and took a deep breath of the fresh morning air. The smell of gasoline and strong coffee was almost comforting. A clerk came out of the convenience store and gave me a curious look. "Long night, huh?" he said, adjusting his cap. "Looks like you saw a ghost." "Almost," I replied, trying to smile. "Did you come from Route 666? He asked, his voice low and serious. I nodded, feeling a shiver run down my spine. "A lot of guys get lost there because of fatigue and sandstorms. The desert can play tricks on your mind. It's easy to panic and think the road is alive." He took a sip of coffee. "But it's just an old, poorly marked road after all." "Just a road," I repeated as if trying to convince myself. He patted me on the shoulder. "Get some rest before you hit the road again. This place messes with your head." I nodded and got back in the truck. Maybe he was right. The combination of extreme fatigue, isolation, and the eerie atmosphere of Route 666 was enough to mess with my mind. The road wasn't alive. There were no shadows chasing anyone. It was just stories and superstition, fed by exhausted truckers like me. But as I turned the key in the ignition, I couldn't help but look one last time at the horizon. The line where the sky met the desert seemed to shimmer, like a mirage. For a second, I thought I saw a dark figure standing there, watching. I shook my head and started the engine. It was just my imagination, or at least that's what I had to believe.